the 8th Sunday after Trinity. O God, whose never failing providence orders us both in heaven, orders all things in heaven and earth. Give us to us the good things that will help us glorify and enjoy you, and keep from us those things that would hinder us glorifying and enjoying you. Verse 5 of hymn 627. Lord, grant us all a right to learn the wisdom it imparts, and to its heavenly teaching turn with simple, childlike hearts. Well, we continue our work here with Professor John Bright on the prologue and the ancient Near East before 2000 BC. The Sumerians, the creators of civilization of Lower Mesopotamia, were the Sumerians, people who constitute one of the major mysteries of all history. Of what race they were and whence they came, we can only guess. The monuments depict them as a clean-shaven, stocky, broad-headed people. But with this last, the skeletal evidence does not always agree. The language is of an agglutinative type, affiliated with any other known language, living or dead. The time and manner of their arrival, whether they were the authors of the oldest Obaid culture, or whether they came later and built on foundations others laid, are points upon which there's no agreement. And there's a work by G.E. Wright, The Pottery of Palestine, from the earliest times to the end of the early bronze period. Also, E.A. Spire, Mesopotamian Origins, H. Frankert, Archaeology and the Sumerian Problem. Sumerians were present in Lower Mesopotamia by the middle of the 4th millennia. Since the earliest texts known to us are in Sumerian, we must assume that it was the Sumerians who introduced writing. In the Proto-Literate period, they gave shape to that brilliant culture, which we see in the classical form in the 3rd millennium dawned. Egypt and Palestine in the 4th millennium. We may proceed somewhat summarily here, for neither Egypt nor Palestine offer in this period anything to compare with the amazing civilization of the pre-dynastic Mesopotamia. Yet in both lands, a series of cultures carries us from the Stone Age down through the 4th millennium and into the 3rd. The Chalcolithic culture in Palestine. Although the 4th millennium in Palestine remains obscure at a number of points, it is clear that it witnessed a development of village life in various parts of the land, with many places apparently being settled for the first time. In this period, Palestine seems to have fallen into 2 cultural provinces, one in the northern and central areas, and the other in the south. The most striking of the Chalcolithic cultures is Gasulian, so called after Tulayat el-Gasul in the Jordan Valley, where it was first identified. It is also found at various places in the land, notably in the neighborhood of Beersheba and in northern Negev. Radiocarbon tests indicate that it flourished in the centuries before and after 3500 BC. Though it is a village culture without great material pretension, it gives considerable artistic and technical progress. Stone implements were still manufactured, but copper also was in use. The pottery, while not to be compared to, I'm just looking ahead here, quite a ways, up to page 44, another 10 pages before we're done with the prologue, before we get into the history of Israel proper. Houses were built of sun-dried, handmade bricks, often on stone foundations. Many of them were decorated inside and out with elaborate polychrome frescoes on the surface of lime plaster. Such designs as an 8-pointed star, a bird. Various geometric figures are instanced. One, much damaged, portrays a group of seated figures, very possibly gods. Strange elephant-like masks serve some nameless cultic purpose, while the fact that the dead were buried with food and utensils beside them argues for belief in a future existence of some sort. None of these Chalcolithic cultures was magnificent, but it is evident that settlement of the land was by this time fairly widespread. The pre-dynastic cultures of Egypt. As has been said, the earliest village culture known to us in Egypt is the Neolithic Fayumian, Fayum Alpha, which dates to the latter part of the 5th millennium. Thereafter, an unbroken series of cultures, both in Upper and Lower Egypt, carries us down through the whole 4th millennium to the threshold of history in the 3rd, in Upper Egypt as we have it. Let me make a particular notation here, because we're going to want to follow up with other history books. We're working with John Bright right now, but who will we want after Bright? Probably Walter Kaiser, and maybe Merrill Unger, and there's another volume, Eugene Merrill. And we want to finish also Robert Dick Wilson's scientific investigation of the Old Testament. Nevertheless, it is here that the foundations of civilization were laid. The pre-dynastic Egyptians were presumably the ancestors of the Egyptians of historical times, thus a mixture of Hamitic, Semitic, and Negroid strains. They made great strides in the development of agriculture, cultivating all sorts of grains, fruits, and vegetables, as well as flax. This meant, as in Mesopotamia, that an increasing density of population could be supported. The task of drainage and irrigation was progressively undertaken, and since this must have required cooperative effort between the villages, we may assume that local governments of some sort existed. Reference here to Kraling and Adams, The City Invincible. Copper was in use, since its source was probably the Sinai Peninsula. Work in the mines must already have begun. As boats moved commerce up and down the Nile, local isolation was decreased. Probably by the end of the 4th millennium, the various local nomes had united into 2 sizable kingdoms. There's a lot of theorizing going on here. One in Upper Egypt and one in Lower. Finally, writing in the hieroglyphic script was invented. By the time of the 1st dynasty, it had already developed beyond its primitive form. International contacts before history is gone. Through most of the pre-dynastic period, Egyptian culture developed with a few signs of contact with the outside world. Late in the 4th millennium, however, the Proto-Literate culture in Mesopotamia and the Chalcolithic period gave way to the succeeding Earl Bronze I stage in Palestine. There's evidence of lively interchange. Frankfurt's Birth of Civilization in the Near East, Indiana University Press, 1951. Palestinian pottery types found in Egypt point to intercourse between the 2 lands, while similar evidence argues that Egypt was even then in contact with the cedar port of Byblos. Even more surprising is the evidence that late Egypt in the late Girzian period was in contact with the proto-literature culture in Mesopotamia and borrowed heavily from it. This borrowing, aside from pottery forms, lay in the area of cylinder seals, of various art motifs and architectural features. Some even think that writing was developed under Mesopotamian influence. How these contacts, most markedly evident in southern Egypt, were transmitted is unknown. But the presence of seal impressions of Gemdet Nasser type at such places as Megiddo and Byblos argue that a major route of exchange lay through Palestine and Syria. At any rate, we have evidence of a period of international contact, cultural transition between the extremities of the biblical world before history arose. Interesting, there's no comment on British Isles, Europe, or beyond. It just seems assumptively to look at Middle East. It's noted. Through contact with Mesopotamia seems virtually to have ceased by the time of the First Dynasty, the 29th century. Egypt continued in an unbroken relationship with Palestine and Phoenicia through the centuries to come. Now we turn to the ancient Orient in the 3rd millennium BC. Mesopotamia in the earliest historical record. Early in the 3rd millennium, history, properly speaking, begins. That is to say, one enters for the first time into an age that is documented by contemporary inscriptions that can, unlike the earlier text of which we have spoken, be read. Though the archaic texts from the beginning of the period still present difficulties, the succeeding centuries offer a profusion of material for the most part intelligible to specialists. The classical Sumerian early dynastic period 2850 to 2360. History's dawn reveals Sumerian civilization fixed in classical form. We get a reference here to several authors, but no books cited in the first 17th footnote. The land was organized into a system of city-states, mostly quite small, of which a dozen or so are known to us by name, although now one, now another was able to assert itself over its neighbors. No permanent, thoroughgoing unification of the land was ever achieved. Apparently such a thing went contrary to tradition and feeling, was even regarded as a sin against the gods. The city-state was a theocracy ruled by a god. Seafront forts, birth of civilization. Fascinating stuff, all in the providence of God. Chapter 5, the Westminster Confession. The city and its lands were the god's estate, the temple, his manor house. There's something to be said there. The globe, the universe, is God's temple, so to speak, even though he's beyond that, infinite, beyond his creation. In one sense, they have a part of that right. The city and its lands were the gods. The state, about the temple with its gardens, fields, storehouses, economic life was organized. The people, in each in his own place, were God's retainers, working on his estate. The earthly head of the state was a Lugal, a great man, the king, or Ninsi, the priest of the local temple, who ruled as the representative of the god, the manager of the estate. This latter figure might be either independent city lord or vassal of the Lugal in another city. Kingship, whatever it was in fact, was not absolute in theory. Power was held by the sanction of divine election. In spite of the tradition that kingship has come down from heaven at the beginning of time, There is evidence that government had originally been a city assembly, and that kingship had developed out of this, first as an emergency measure, subsequently as a permanent institution. Whatever this system may have lacked in political stability, it made possible a measure of prosperity. Urban and agrarian life were closely integrated, making for a marked economic stability. Whatever the wars, though no doubt frequent and bitter enough, were sporadic and local. It was essentially a time of peace in which economic life could flourish. Improved agriculture permitted the support of an increased population. Urban life, in turn, allowed play for greater specialization in the arts and crafts. The cities, though small by modern standards, were quite large by ancient ones. Though most of the houses were humble, great temples and palaces were numerous. Metalworking and gem cutting reached heights of excellence seldom surpassed. Solid wheeled vehicles drawn by oxen or asses were employed for both military and pacific purposes. Trade and cultural contacts reached far and wide. About the temples, scribal schools flourished, producing a vast body of literature. Take note. Stuff Moses would have been exposed to. Records which Moses would have had access to. Most of the epic tales and myths which we know from later copies were written down at this time, though transmitted orally for centuries previously. So he thinks. The religion of the Sumerians. Sumerian religion was a highly developed polytheism. Its gods, albeit with considerable fluidity as regards sex and function, already in early times ranged in a complex pantheon of relative stability. Active head of the pantheon was Enlil, lord of the storm. The cults of various gods were carried on in the cities where they conceived to have their seats. Nippur, center of the cult of Enlil, enjoyed a neutral position, receiving vote offerings from all the other over the land and never becoming a seat of a dynasty. Although the god's prestige rose or fell with that of the city in which he had residence, these were not local gods, but were thought of as cosmic in function and were accorded universal domain. The order of the gods was conceived as a heavenly state on the pattern of a city assembly, but only beginning to see projection onto God of humanity's conception. And the difference between that and divine religion is God coming to us. The peace of the earthly order thus rested on a precarious balance between conflicting wills which could be upset at any time. The power struggle on earth was also a legal process in the state of the gods. The victory of one city over others represented the endorsement of claims by Enlil, king of the gods. Calamity on earth reflected the anger of the gods at some affront. It was the function of the cult to serve the gods, propitiate their wrath, and thus maintain peace and stability. And we see even in the world of natural religion the same ideas, or similarity of ideas, with the one true and living God. This shouldn't surprise us that it's created in every single human being to have a religious instinct. Earthly laws were supposed to be the reflection of the laws of God. Although no law code is so old, the forms of Jura, Kajina, the 24th century, who took various measures in accordance with the righteous laws of Mingirsu, designed to put a stop to all sorts of mispractice, including the exploitation of the poor, illustrate the idea that law is very ancient. Yet it must be said, as is the case in all paganisms, the Sumerian drew little distinction between the moral and purely ritual offenses. Semites in Mesopotamia, Akkadians, and I think you can study Akkadian in some schools. I'm trying to think of whether they had that at Westminster. I forget now. The fortunes of the various Sumerian city-states is not our concern, though now and then a local dynast, such as Anatum of Lagash, 25th century, or Lugal-Zagisi of Erech, 24th century, may have exercised ephemeral control over most of Sumer. None of them able to bring unification to the land. The Sumerians, however, were not the only people dwelling in Mesopotamia. There was also a Semitic population. These Semites were known as Akkadians after the seat of their first empire. While there is no evidence that they preceded the Sumerians in the Tigris-Euphrates plain, they were by no means newcomers there. No doubt they had been semi-nomads in the area of northwest of Sumer since the earliest times, and had pressed in increasing numbers since the 4th millennium. By the mid-3rd millennium, and we just throw these words around millennium, one thing history does is shows how little and tiny we are in our own little position, and functions and helps us to humble us to think that we've arrived. We're so advanced compared to those backwoodsmen in the 3rd millennium BC. They didn't know anything. They didn't write. They weren't sophisticated, Though they spoke a Semitic language entirely different from the Sumerian, they borrowed the cuneiform syllabic script to write. Texts in Akkadian reach back to the mid-3rd millennium. They also adopted the Sumerian pantheon, although they added gods of their own and applied Semitic names to others. So thoroughly was this done that it is impossible to distinguish distinctively Semitic from Sumerian elements in Mesopotamian religion. Whatever tensions may have existed between the two populations, there is no evidence of racial or cultural conflict. We may not doubt that an increasing intermingling of the races took place. The Empire of Akkad, 2360 to 2180. We're getting down closer here to Abraham. In the 24th century, a dynasty of Semitic rulers sieged power and created the first true empire in world history. The founder was Sargon, a figure whose origins are cloaked in myth. Rising to power in Kish, he overthrew Lugal-Zagisi of Erech and subdued all Sumer as far as the Persian Gulf, then transferring his residence to Akkad, of unknown location, but near the later Babylon. He embarked on a series of conquests which became legendary. Sargon was succeeded by 2 of his sons and then by a grandson, Naram-Sin. The boast of exploits fully as spectacular as Sargon's own. Aside from Sumer, the kings of Akkad ruled all upper Mesopotamia, as inscriptions and business documents from Nuzi, Nineveh, Shagar Bazar, and Tel Ibrak show. but their control extended at least intermittently from Ilangum to the Mediterranean, while military expeditions ranged into the highlands of Asia Minor, into southeastern Arabia, and perhaps further. Trade contacts reached as far as the Indus Valley. It's quite a ways out east, as memory serves. The kings of Akkad gave to Sumerian culture a political expression far beyond the bounds of the city-state. Although they preserved the tradition that power was derived from Enlil, it is likely that somewhat different theory of kingship emerged. The state did not center in the temple of the god, as this city-state had, but in the palace. There's some evidence that the kings of Akkad accorded themselves divine prerogatives. Naramsin is depicted in gigantic proportions, wearing the horned tiara of the gods, while his name appears with a divine determinative. The triumph of Akkad hastened the ascendancy of the Akkadian language, Akkadian. Royal inscriptions were written in Akkadian, and there was considerable literary activity in that language. Probably the so-called hymnal epic dialect had its origin in this period. At the very same time, art freed from the standardized Sumerian canons enjoyed a remarkable revival. Though the power of Akkad was of brief duration, as history views such things, it lasted for over 100 years. Egypt and Western Asia in the third millennium, almost exactly coincidental with the earliest decipherable texts in Mesopotamia. Egypt emerged into history as a unified nation. Precisely how the two pre-dynastic kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt were united, whether or not after an earlier tentative effort had failed, is disputed. But by the 29th century, the kings of Upper Egypt had gained the ascendancy and brought the whole land under their sway. King Narmer, First Dynasty, is depicted wearing the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north, and drawn in giant proportions, as befits God. It's got Frankfurt again, kingship and the gods. The Old Kingdom, 29th to 23rd century. You can't just throw out 600 years in a paragraph or two. Pretty amazing. The foundations of the Old Kingdom were laid by the pharaohs of the first and second dynasties. With the rise of the third dynasty, about 2600, we entered the age of Egypt's classical flowering, by which time all the magnificent features of her culture had assumed a form therever after to be normative. This was the age of the pyramids. Oldest of these is Step Pyramid with Zoser, founder of the third dynasty, built at Memphis with the mortuary temple at its base. It is the oldest building of hewn stone so far known. Far more marvelous, however, are the pyramids of Cheops, Khafre, and Mycerinus of the fourth dynasty, 26th to 25th century. Likewise, at Memphis, the Great Pyramid, 481 feet in height, its base 755 by 755. It's constructed of some 2.3 million blocks of hewn stone of an average weight of 2.5 tons. And these were reared into place by sheer brawn, without benefit of machinery, yet with a maximum error of virtually nil. And there's a footnote to J.A. Wilson's The Burden of Egypt, University of Chicago Press, 1951. The error in squareness is placed at not over 0.09%. The deviation from the level at 0.004%. Pretty accurate, given its size. Throughout this entire period, Egypt continued in contact with Asia, though evidence of Mesopotamian influence virtually ceases after the beginning of the dynasties. Relationships with Phoenicia, Palestine, and the adjacent lands continued unbroken. The copper mines of Sinai, worked in pre-dynastic times, were regularly exploited. Contact with Canaanite lands is witnessed by the interchange of pottery types and other objects, as well as by the passage of Canaanite words into the English language. Various pharaohs are known to have campaigned in Asia. This does not prove that Egypt had yet organized an Asiatic empire. It does show she regarded Palestinian lands as her legitimate sphere of interest. Byblos, however, as in all periods of Egyptian strength, was virtually a colony. Since Egypt is almost treeless, Byblos, outlet for the hardwoods of Lebanon, was always of vital importance to her. Votive inscriptions of various pharaohs and other objects attest Egyptian influence there all through the Old Kingdom. Before the end of the third millennium, Canaanites in Byblos had developed a syllabic script modeled on the Egyptian hieroglyphics. State and religion in Egypt. The organization of the state in Egypt differed vastly from that of contemporary Mesopotamia. The pharaoh was no viceroy ruling by divine election, nor was he a man who was deified. He was God, or as visible among his people. In theory, all of Egypt was his property, all her resources at his disposal of his projects. Although the land was actually managed by a complex bureaucracy headed by a vizier, this too served the God King. No law code has ever been discovered in ancient Egypt, though one cannot say dogmatically that none existed. Of course, it existed. Maybe they just haven't found it. It's in man's nature to have rules, created in the image of God. To be sure, the concept of law was not lacking. Thank you, for no state can well exist without it. Though the power of Pharaoh was in theory absolute, he did not rule without regard for accepted standards, for it was his duty as God King to uphold ma'at, justice. And though the system was an absolutism under which no Egyptian in theory free, though the lot of the peasant must have been unbelievably hard, no rigid barriers existed to prevent men of humblest origin from rising to the highest positions if fortune favored them. It was a system which was, in Egyptian eyes, a beneficent means of maintaining the peace and security of the land. The Egyptian did not view his world as precariously balanced, problematic thing, as did the Mesopotamian, but as a changeless order established at creation, as regular in its rhythm as the Nile floods. The cornerstone of this unchanging order was the God King. In his life he protected his people. At his death he lived on in the world of the gods, to be succeeded by his son, also God. Society headed by the God King was thus securely anchored in the rhythm of the cosmos. To our minds, the spectacle of the state, exhausting its resources To provide a tomb for the pharaoh can seem only madness, and on the part of Pharaoh himself, an egocentric disregard for the welfare of the people. But the Egyptians scarcely saw it so. So he interprets. Though the absolute state proved too great a burden to be borne forever, and modifications were made, the Egyptians never, in theory at least, rejected the system. He's inserting an awful lot of his own views here. Egyptian religion, like that of Mesopotamia, was highly developed. Polytheism, to be sure, it presents a most confusing picture. In spite of various attempts in earliest times at systematization, the cosmogonies of Heliopolis and Hermopolis, the Memphite theology, no orderly pantheon or consistent cosmogony was ever developed. We don't know that. It just asserts it again. Fluidity of thought was thoroughly characteristic of the Egyptian mind. Nevertheless, Egyptian religion cannot be called primitive, although many of its gods were depicted in animal form. The essential characteristics of a totemism were lacking. The animal represented the form in which the mysterious divine power manifested itself. And although the prestige of God might fluctuate with that of the city where his cult was practiced, the high gods of Egypt were not local gods, but were honored all over the land and accorded cosmic dominion. Palestine in the early Bronze Age. In Palestine, the bulk of the third millennium falls into the period known by archaeologists as Early Bronze. This period, or transitional phase leading into it, began in the late fourth millennium as the proto-literate culture flourished in Mesopotamia, and the Gurzean in Egypt continued to the closing centuries of the third. I have a footnote here to Kenyon volume called Digging. Wright begins the period after 3300. And Kenyon and him have a debate, 30, 3000 BC. Let them debate it out. It's a time of great urban development, population increase, cities were built. Though population seems to have been unevenly distributed, thicker in the northern, sparser in the south, cities were fairly numerous. Many of the towns that were later to play their part in the Bible were in existence. Jericho, rebuilt after a long abandonment. Megiddo, Beit Shan, Ai, Gezer, Lachish, a number of them built for the first time. Though these cities were scarcely magnificent, they were surprisingly well built and strongly fortified, as excavations at Jericho, Megiddo, Ai, and elsewhere show. City walls, a footnote here, sometimes 25 or 30 feet thick. The great double wall of Jericho, actually two separate walls, once thought to be that destroyed before Joshua, belongs in this period. The population of Palestine and Philistia in this period was at least predominantly Canaanite, a people of whom we shall have more to say later. Their language was probably the ancestor of that spoken by Canaanites in Israelite times, of which Hebrew was a biblical dialect. Biblical Hebrew was a dialect. In all likelihood, they settled in Palestine in the fourth millennium. They were actually to be regarded as the founders of the early Bronze civilization. It's got S. Moscati, the Semites, and ancient history. At any rate, the names of the oldest towns known to us are uniformly Semitic. It is likely that the myths that we now know from the Rosh Hashanah texts, 14th century, go back to the prototypes of this period, and that Canaanite religion was already in all essentials the same as that seen there and still later in the Bible. While Palestine yields no inscriptions from the third millennium, Canaanites at Byblos, as we have seen, had developed a syllabic script modeled on the Egyptian. The ancient Orient on the eve of the patriarchal period. The closing centuries of the third millennium bring us to the verge of the age in which Israel's story begins. These were disturbed centuries with movements, migrations, and invasions which upset patterns in all parts of the Bible world. In Mesopotamia, there was an end to the long history of Sumerian culture. In Egypt, a time of disintegration and confusion. In Palestine, sheer havoc. Mesopotamia, the fall of Akkad and the Sumerian Renaissance. We've seen that in the 24th century, power passed from the Sumerian city-states to the Semitic kings of Akkad, who created a great empire. After the conquests of Naram-Sin, however, the power of Akkad rapidly waned, and soon after 2200 was brought to an end by the onslaught of a barbarian people called the Gudi. These people, whose home was in Zagros Mountains, held sway over the land for about 100 years. A brief dark age resulted from which few records survive, during which Hurrians infiltrated the East Tigris region, while Amorites further entrenched themselves across Upper Mesopotamia. We shall have more to say of these people later. But since Gudian control was loose, it is likely that Sumerian cities were able to maintain a semi-independent existence in the south. The Guti, in fact, by destroying the power of Akkad, paved the way for the renaissance of a Sumerian culture, which came to flower under the third dynasty of Ur. Actually, the grip of Guti was broken and the land liberated by Uto-Higal, king of Erech, but he was speedily overthrown by Ur-Nammu, founder of Ur-3. Though the kings of Ur say little of war, they were probably able to control most of the Mesopotamian plain, while rulers still farther afield at least nominally acknowledged their authority, styling themselves the kings of Sumer and Akkad, and kings of the four parts of the world. They came to be the perpetuators both of the empire of Sargon and Sumerian culture. Whether or to what degree they claimed for themselves the divine prerogatives, as the kings of Akkad had done, is disputed. Certain of them wrote their names with divine determinative and took the title of the god of his land. But this may have been a little more than conventional language, for the notion of kinship by divine designation still existed. Though the king was in theory an absolute monarch, and the rulers of the various cities his deputies, the latter in practice enjoyed considerable freedom in the management of local affairs. Under the king of Ur-3, Sumerian culture flourished. The founder Ur-Nammu is noted not only for his many buildings and for literary activity in his reign, but above all for his law code, oldest so far known. The best evidence of the Renaissance, however, comes from Lagash, where one Gudea was Ensi, E-N-S-I, the ruler whose precise date is a disputed subject that cannot detain us, has left us many inscriptions and monuments ruling in Lagash as the shepherd of Ningirsu. He was Ensi after the old Sumerian manner in the tradition of the reformer Uruk-Agina. Exquisite statuary and objects of art produced in his day show Sumerian artistic skill at its best. But if the Renaissance was glorious, it was also the last. Sumerian culture had come to the end of a road. Even the Sumerian language was dying, although inscriptions of Ur-3 are in Sumerian. Akkadian was superseding it as the vernacular. By the 18th century, it ceased altogether to be spoken, though it survived in learned liturgical use, as Latin did for many centuries thereafter. Sumerians and Semites were completely mixed by this time, and the latter had become the predominant element. Even some of the kings of Ur, Shushan ibn Sind, though of a Sumerian house, had Semitic names, and no doubt Semitic blood. In Mesopotamia, the age of Israel's origins, a whole tide of civilization had flowed and ebbed. Sumerian culture had come into being, run a magnificent course over 1,500 years, and finally played itself out. Israel was born into a world already ancient. Egypt, first intermediate period, about the 22nd to 21st century. In Egypt, meanwhile, the glory of the old kingdom faded away. After the end of the 5th dynasty, the monolithic period power of the state began progressively to disintegrate, and effective power passed increasingly from the hands of the pharaoh to those of hereditary provincial nobility. By the 22nd century, approximately as the Guti were destroying the power of Akkad, Egypt entered a period of discord and depression, known as the First Intermediate. There was internal disunity, with rival pharaohs claiming the throne, provincial administrators uncontrolled by the crown exercised a feudal authority and became, in effect, local kings. Certain towns in Lower Egypt were virtually independent under city councils. Matters were further aggravated by the infiltration of Asiatic semi-nomads into the delta. Since the irrigation system upon which the life of the land depended was probably not maintained, there was undoubtedly widespread hardship and famine. It was a time of serious depression, and this depression entered apparently into the Egyptian soul. We have from this period, or a little later, a literature that is rich and most appealing, reflecting the mood of the times. Aside from a concern for social justice, for example, The Eloquent Peasant, one senses a profound bewilderment and pessimism, and the feeling that times were out of joint. For example, the dialogue of a misanthrope with his soul, the song of the harper, referred to by Albright, also J. Van Ceder's The Hyksos, Yale Press, 1966. It must have seemed to many Egyptians, battered as they were by adversity, that all they had known and believed in had failed them. That civilization, after 1,000 years of steady progress, had come to an end. And this long before Abraham was born. He puts an exclamation point behind it. Almost like he's excited by this stuff before Abraham. Interesting. Of course, if so they thought, they were wrong. In the mid-21st century, approximately as Sumerian culture was reviving under the kings of Ur, a Theban family, the 11th dynasty was able to reunite the land and bring an end to the chaos. As the second millennium began, Egypt entered her second period of prosperity and stability under pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom. Palestine, the nomadic invaders and those disruptions. The latter part of the third millennium, roughly between the 23rd and 20th centuries, just roughly 300 years. As we pass through the final phase of the early Bronze Age into the first phase of the Middle Bronze, or perhaps enter a transitional period between the two, we encounter abundant evidence that life in Palestine suffered a major disruption at the hands of nomadic invaders who were pressing into the land. City after city was destroyed. As far as is known, every major city was, some with incredible violence, and the early Bronze civilization was brought to an end. By the end of the third millennium, such villages are known to have existed both east and west of the Jordan, in the Jordan Valley, and as far south as Negev. But they were small, poorly constructed, and without material pretensions. It was not until approximately the 19th century when a fresh and vigorous cultural influence spread across the lands that urban life can be said to have resumed. What these nomadic newcomers called themselves, we do not know. No doubt they belonged to various tribal groups and went by different names, but it is very likely that they were part of the general group of the northwest Semitic peoples known as the Amorites, who were pressing upon all parts of the Fertile Crescent at this time. We have a footnote here. It's been questioned that these people should be called Amorites, Ascati, but in view of all the evidence, it seems most appropriate designation for them. Kathleen Kenyon, Amorites and Canaanites, Oxford Press, 1966, who agrees but reserves the term Canaanite for the culture that emerged in the Middle Bronze Age. Intermediate, we shall say more of these people later. Perhaps were our eyes but sharp enough, we might discern among them, or following after them as part of the same general movement, the figures of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Such then was the stage of world history upon which Israel's ancestors were soon to step. If we have set that stage with greater care than might seem necessary, it is ordered that Israel's beginnings may be seen in no foreshortened perspective, but against the backdrop of many centuries and civilizations ancient. Part 1, we're now finish that chapter, the prologue, antecedents and beginnings, the age of the patriarchs. Officially now, we're in chapter 1, the world of Israel's origins. This will go for, let me see here, get this math right, about 15 pages, and then chapter 2 will be the patriarchs. First half of the second millennium, roughly 2000 to 1550, brings us to an age of Israel's origins. It was at some time during the course of these centuries that Father Abraham set out from Haran with his family, his flocks, his herds to seek land and seed in the place his God would show him. Or to put it otherwise, there took place a migration of Palestine, of semi-nomadic peoples among whom were to be found the ancestors of Israel. With there they began that chain of events so portentous for world history and so redemptive. The believing man would say so divinely guided. I'm one of those, which we call the history of Israel. The believing man would say divinely guided. portentous for world history, and so redemptive. Beautiful, very nice. Touche, Prof. Bright. One might say, to be sure, the object that to begin the history of Israel so early is very bold and a loose word of the use of the term history. Such an objection, if raised, has a certain validity. The history of Israel cannot indeed begin so soon, for there was not yet a people, Israel. No, but there was a church. And where was it? And what did it look like? Believers in the Edenic promise of the proto-evangel, Enoch, Noah, and all that comes until we come to Abraham. But I take the point. Not, in fact, until the 13th century and after, when we find settled in Palestine its presence attested by archaeological data, contemporary records, the people called Israel. Can the history of Israel, properly speaking, be said to begin? No. Here's where Old Testament stuff has to be augmented by systematics of church history. Now, the Old Testament guys are going to whine and complain about that. Oh well. God's given us a canon. God's the canon. God's the historian. It's infinitely far above John Bright and all of us. Before that, we have only semi-nomadic wanderers elusively roaming the map of the years, unattested by contemporary record, leaving behind them no tangible trace of their passing. These wanderers and Israel's ancestors do not belong to the story, but to the prehistory of Israel. Nevertheless, since the prehistory of a people, so far as it can be known, is also a part of that people's history, we must begin here. Furthermore, Israel was not, in fact, the stock indigenous to Palestine. She had come from elsewhere and was well aware of the fact. Through a body of sacred tradition quite without parallel in the ancient world, she remembered her conquest of her land, the long desert march that had brought her thither, the marvelous experiences that she attended. And before that, years of hard bondage in Egypt. She also remembered how centuries earlier still, her ancestors had come from faraway Mesopotamia to wander in the land she now called her own. Granted that to attempt to use these traditions as historical sources presents severe problems that cannot be shirked. The traditions by all means are to be taken seriously. We must begin with the age to which they refer, evaluate them in the light of such data as are available, and then say what we can of Israel's origins. Our first task is to describe the world of the day in order to provide for ourselves the proper perspective. This is not easy to do, for it was almost a confused world, its stage in fact so crowded with players that the action is difficult to follow. Nevertheless, attempt if we must, with what brevity and clarity can be managed. Okay, we'll call that a day here. Verse 1 of hymn 628. To watch it as a 20th century hymn, to watch the 20th century. Help us, O Lord, to learn the truths your word imparts, to study that your laws may be inscribed upon our hearts. Help us, O Lord, to live the faith which we proclaim, that all our thoughts and words and deeds may glorify your name. Help us, Lord, to teach the beauty of your ways, that yearning souls may find Christ and live a life praise. Okay, we can live on that. Very evangelical too. Let us pray. And now unto the God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost, three persons, one God, be ascribed as is most justly due, all might, majesty, dominion, and power, both now and forever, world without end. Amen. Until next time, brothers and sisters, Godspeed.